The telephone's shrill cry pierced the autumn silence of Detective Marcus Blackwood's study at precisely 11:47 p.m. Rain hammered against the Georgian windows of his Manhattan townhouse as he set down his leather-bound copy of Winwood, Reed's The Martyrdom of Man, and reached for the receiver with a gloved hand. Blackwood speaking. "Detective, thank God you're there." The voice belonged to Inspector Carter, though stripped of its usual confidence. "I need your help. We have a situation at the Ashford Gallery upstate a locked room mystery that's got my entire team baffled." Marcus straightened in his chair, the firelight dancing across his angular features. At 45, he possessed the refined bearing of a classical scholar, yet his steel-gray eyes held the penetrating intensity of a man who had spent decades unraveling the darkest corners of human nature. Details. Inspector. Victor Ashford, the gallery owner, found dead in his private viewing room 2 hours ago. Door locked from the inside, windows secured, no other way in or out. But here's the peculiar part. The man was murdered. Poisoned by the looks of it, though the coroner won't commit until morning. Marcus glanced at the clock. The witching hour approached, and with it the kind of mystery that made his pulse quicken. "I'll be there within 2 hours. Don't let anyone disturb the scene. Already sealed." "Detective, there's something else. We have 6 guests who were attending a private auction tonight. All of them had access to the gallery before Ashford was found. All of them had motive." The line crackled with static as thunder rolled across the city. Marcus felt the familiar stirring, the hunter's instinct awakening. "Have Eleanor meet me there. And Carter. Make sure no one leaves." After ending the call, Marcus moved with practiced efficiency. Within minutes, he had donned his charcoal wool overcoat and retrieved his investigation kit, a leather satchel containing magnifying glasses, sample vials, measuring instruments, and a small but powerful camera. The tools of a trade that had earned him recognition. From Scotland Yard to the NYPD, the drive north through the Catskill Mountains proved treacherous. Eleanor Hayes had met him at the city limits, her auburn hair pulled back in a severe bun, her green eyes bright with anticipation despite the late hour. At 30, she possessed an insatiable curiosity that made her invaluable as an assistant, though her tendency toward impulsiveness occasionally required careful management. "Tell me about the Ashford Gallery," Marcus said as Eleanor navigated the winding mountain roads. "Prestigious private gallery, specializing in European masters. Victor Ashford inherited it from his father 15 years ago. Known for exclusive auctions, invitation only, high-stakes bidding wars." She downshifted as they climbed a steep grade. Tonight's auction featured a recently discovered Monet, estimated value $3 million. Motive enough for murder, certainly. "Who were the guests?" Eleanor consulted her notes. 6 individuals. Dr. Helena Morrison, art historian from Columbia. She's been questioning the Monet's authenticity. James Rothschild, private collector, known for aggressive acquisition tactics. Sandra Vance, gallery director from Boston, Ashford's former business partner and current rival. Thomas Wright, insurance investigator, was there to assess the Monet for coverage. Rebecca Sterling, young art dealer with rumored financial troubles. And finally, Professor Edmund Blackthorne, elderly collector and Ashford's mentor. Marcus absorbed this information, already forming preliminary theories. 6 suspects, each with potential motive, trapped in an isolated gallery with a dead man. The classic locked room scenario that had challenged Detective. Minds for generations, the Ashford Gallery emerged from the darkness like a Gothic mansion, its limestone facade illuminated by strategically placed spotlights. Situated on a remote hillside overlooking the Hudson Valley, the building commanded an imposing presence. Police vehicles flanked the circular drive, their red and blue lights painting the scene in ominous hues. Inspector Carter met them at the entrance. his usually immaculate uniform wrinkled from stress. A competent officer in his mid-30s, Carter had worked with Marcus on several cases and knew when to step aside for expertise beyond his own. Status report, Marcus demanded as they entered the marble-floored foyer. Victim found at 9:30 p.m. by Miss Sterling when he failed to return to the auction. She alerted the others, and Dr. Morrison broke down the door to his private viewing room. Ashford was slumped over his desk, glass of brandy beside him, showing classic signs of poisoning blue lips, dilated pupils, the works. Who touched the body? Dr. Morrison checked for pulse, but she's got medical training. Otherwise, the scene's been preserved exactly as found. Marcus surveyed the gallery's layout. The main auction room occupied the center, with several smaller viewing chambers branching off like spokes of a wheel. Ashford's private office lay at the far end, accessible only through a corridor lined with priceless paintings. The locked door described the mechanism, old-fashioned mortise lock, key on the inside. Door fits snugly in the frame, impossible to slip anything through. Windows are casement style, locked from within, and the rooms on the second floor with no adjacent structures. Eleanor made notes while Marcus studied the gallery's security system. Motion detectors, pressure plates beneath valuable pieces, closed-circuit cameras covering every angle except, he noted with interest, Ashford's private office. Privacy was paramount for his most exclusive dealings, Carter explained. No cameras in the viewing rooms or office. Convenient for our killer. Where are the suspects now? Library, under guard. They're getting restless been there for over 2 hours? Marcus nodded. The psychological pressure would be building, potentially loosening tongues and revealing inconsistencies. But first, he needed to examine the crime scene while it remained pristine. The corridor leading to Ashford's office felt like a tunnel through time. Renaissance masters gazed down from gilt frames, Botticelli, Da Vinci, Raphael, their subjects seeming to watch with knowing eyes. The air carried the musty scent of old leather and canvas, tinged with something more acrid that made Marcus's nostrils twitch. Smell that? He asked Eleanor. She inhaled deeply. Almonds. Very faint, but distinct. Cyanide. Marcus felt a chill of professional excitement. Poison murders required intimate access to the victim. This killer had moved in close. Personal circles. Ashford's office door bore fresh scratches around the log where it had been forced. Inside, the scene told its story in careful detail. Victor Ashford, a distinguished man in his early 60s, sat slumped forward at an antique mahogany desk. His silver hair was disheveled, and his face bore the telltale signs of cyanide poisoning blue-tinged lips, a frozen expression of surprise and agony. The brandy glass sat precisely where Carter had described, still containing perhaps an inch of amber liquid. Marcus photographed it from multiple angles before carefully lifting it with tweezers. The crystal showed no unusual residue, but the almond scent grew stronger near the rim. Cyanide in the brandy, Eleanor observed. So it appears. But notice the positioning. Marcus indicated the glass's placement relative to Ashford's body. If he drank poison and collapsed forward, the glass should be closer to the edge, possibly knocked over. This suggests someone repositioned it after death, staging the scene. Indeed, our killer wanted this to appear as suicide, a man overwhelmed by some crisis, choosing poison over exposure. Marcus examined the desk's contents. Financial documents, auction catalogs, correspondence with potential buyers. Nothing immediately suspicious, yet something felt deliberately arranged. Eleanor discovered the first truly intriguing clue near the window. Marcus, look at this. A small piece of paper, folded into a tight square, had been wedged behind the window's locking mechanism. Marcus carefully extracted it with forceps and unfolded it under his desk lamp. The message, written in block letters with black ink, contained only 4 words. You know my secret? Blackmail? Eleanor suggested, or misdirection. Marcus studied the paper's texture and ink composition under his magnifying glass. High-quality stock, fountain pen ink, deliberately disguised handwriting. Sophisticated work. A thorough search revealed several more anomalies. Ashford's appointment calendar showed a 9:15, meeting marked only as private discussion 15 minutes before his body was discovered. His personal safe stood open, though Carter confirmed it had been locked when police arrived. Who had the combination? Marcus asked. Only Ashford, according to his records. But someone opened it tonight. Asterisk inside the safe. Marcus found auction receipts, certificates of authenticity, and a manila envelope containing photographs of the disputed Monet. The painting showed subtle variations from known catalog images differences that only an expert eye would detect. The authentication controversy runs deeper than we thought, Marcus murmured. Studying the photographs, someone has been very thorough in documenting irregularities. Asterisk at 1:30 a.m. With the crime scene thoroughly documented, Marcus felt ready to confront the suspects. 6 individuals, each harboring secrets, each with opportunity and motive. The psychology of group dynamics would work in his favor under pressure. Alliances would form and fracture, revealing the truth beneath carefully constructed facades. The library, where the suspects waited, resembled a scene from an English country house mystery. Floor-to-ceiling mahogany shelves held first edition volumes on art history, while Persian rugs muffled footsteps across hardwood floors. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across faces etched with anxiety and suspicion. Dr. Helena Morrison sat apart from the others, her academic bearing evident in wire-rimmed glasses and conservative gray suit. James Rothschild paced near the windows, his expensive Italian shoes clicking against the floor in nervous rhythm. Sandra Vance had claimed a chair near the fire, her sharp business attire and platinum blonde hair making her appear like a coiled spring ready to release. Thomas Wright studied insurance documents with professional detachment, while Rebecca Sterling fidgeted with her phone, her youthful face pale with stress. Professor Edmund Blackthorne, elderly and distinguished, dozed in a leather armchair, seemingly unperturbed by the night's events. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus announced, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "I am Detective Marcus Blackwood, consulting investigator. I'm here to discover which of you killed Victor Ashford." The statement hit like a physical blow. Rothschild stopped pacing. Dr. Morrison removed her glasses to clean them, a nervous gesture. Sandra Vance's jaw tightened visibly. "Only Professor." Blackthorne seemed unsurprised, opening his eyes with calm curiosity. "This is preposterous," Rothschild declared. "Victor committed suicide." "The door was locked from inside. Mr. Rothschild, I've investigated over 200 homicides. Suicide victims don't typically arrange blackmail notes after swallowing cyanide." Marcus let the implication sink in. Someone in this room murdered Victor Ashford, staged the scene to appear as suicide, and hoped to escape detection among the confusion of 6 potential suspects. Rebecca Sterling's phone clattered to the floor. "Blackmail notes? What blackmail notes?" "An interesting question, Miss Sterling. Why would you assume the existence of multiple notes unless you knew of their placement?" The young woman flushed red. I mean, you said notes, plural. I said note, singular. Your subconscious revealed more than you intended." Eleanor took notes as Marcus began his psychological dissection. Each suspect would be isolated, pressured, their stories compared for inconsistencies. The killer had made mistakes, they always did. His task was to identify which threads to pull until the entire fabrication unraveled. But first, he needed to understand the deeper motivations at play. Murder was never really about money or art or even blackmail. It was about fear of exposure, fear of loss, fear of consequences that seemed worse than taking a human life. As he studied the 6 faces before him, Marcus Blackwood felt the familiar thrill of the hunt. Somewhere in this room sat a killer clever enough to conceive and execute an elaborate deception. But they had made one fatal error. They had underestimated the methodical patience of a man whose entire life was devoted to unraveling lies. The game, as his literary hero would say, was afoot. The interrogation room at the Ashford Gallery had been hastily arranged in a small viewing chamber adjacent to the library. Marcus Blackwood positioned himself behind an ornate writing desk, while Eleanor prepared her shorthand notebook. Inspector Carter stood near the door, his presence serving as a reminder that this was officially a police investigation. "I'll speak with each of you individually," Marcus announced to the assembled suspects. "Dr. Morrison, we'll begin with you." The art historian entered with academic composure, settling into the chair opposite Marcus with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to lectures and committee meetings. Her wire-rimmed glasses caught the lamplight as she folded her hands precisely in her lap. "Doctor, you discovered Mr. Ashford's body. Walk me through those moments." The auction concluded at 9:15. Mr. Ashford excused himself to handle what he called final preparations. When he hadn't returned by 9:25, I became concerned. He was meticulous about timing. Dr. Morrison's voice carried the measured cadence of academia. I went to his office, found the door locked, knocked repeatedly, no response. That's when I alerted the others. Who suggested breaking down the door? I did. My medical training includes emergency response. The situation felt wrong. She paused, choosing her words carefully. I've seen enough cardiac events at faculty meetings to recognize urgency. Marcus leaned forward. You examined the body immediately? Brief pulse check only. It was obvious he was deceased. The cyanide symptoms were textbook classic. I specifically did not disturb the scene beyond that initial contact. Textbook classic. You recognize cyanide poisoning instantly? The almond scent, facial discoloration, body positioning, yes. I identified it immediately. My doctoral dissertation included extensive research on Renaissance-era assassination methods. Cyanide features prominently in several historical cases. Eleanor scribbled notes while Marcus absorbed this information. Dr. Morrison possessed both. Motive, the authentication dispute, and expertise that could facilitate poison murder. Yet her clinical approach seemed almost too forthright for deception. The Monet authentication. You've been vocal about questioning its legitimacy. Dr. Morrison's composure cracked slightly. That painting is not authentic Claude Monet. I've staked my professional reputation on proving it. The brushwork, pigment analysis, provenance documentation, everything suggests a sophisticated forgery. Sophisticated enough to fool other experts. Unfortunately, yes. Which is why Victor was so determined to auction it tonight despite my objections. $3 million provides powerful incentive to ignore inconvenient facts. Did Mr. Ashford threaten your career over this dispute? Not directly. But he controlled significant influence in art authentication circles. A negative recommendation from him could destroy academic credibility. Her voice turned bitter. Academic politics can be surprisingly vicious, Detective. Marcus studied her face for micro-expressions indicating deception. Where were you between 9 and 9:25 this evening? In the main auction room with the other guests. We were discussing the evening's lots, sharing observations about various pieces. I was specifically conversing with Professor Blackthorne about attribution methodologies. Witnesses to this conversation, everyone present. It wasn't a private discussion. Marcus dismissed Dr. Morrison and summoned James Rothschild. The collector entered with barely contained agitation, his expensive suit wrinkled, his usual polish replaced by nervous energy. Mr. Rothschild, your relationship with Victor Ashford? Asterisk professional. cordial. He facilitated some of my most important acquisitions over the past decade. Rothschild's hands trembled slightly as he lit a cigarette. Victor had exquisite taste and connections throughout Europe. Losing him is a genuine tragedy for the collecting community. Yet you've been accused of using aggressive tactics to acquire desired pieces. Rothschild's eyes flashed dangerously. Aggressive, I prefer thorough. When you're competing for unique artworks, half measures guarantee failure. I research provenance, I verify authenticity, I outbid competitors. That's not aggression, that's professional excellence, including tonight's Monet. Especially tonight's Monet. Despite Dr. Morrison's academic posturing, that painting is legitimate. I've had it examined by 3 independent experts, all confirmed authenticity. I was prepared to bid $4 million, possibly higher. Marcus noted the financial stakes. $4 million represents significant investment, even for someone of your means. Detective, I've spent over $50 million building my collection. $4 million for a genuine Monet is actually conservative. Rothschild stubbled out his cigarette with sharp movements. What I can't afford is having my reputation destroyed by association with forgeries. Every piece in my collection has been thoroughly vetted. Where were you during the critical time period? Same as the other's main auction room. I was examining catalog descriptions, making notes for bidding strategy. I specifically remember discussing provenance details with Thomas Wright around 9:10. Mr. Wright was evaluating the pieces for insurance purposes. Correct. We compared authentication documents, discussed market valuations. Thomas knows his business. We've worked together on several acquisitions. Eleanor looked up from her notes. Did Mr. Ashford seem unusual tonight? Nervous, distracted, concerned about something? Rothschild considered this. Now that you mention it, yes. He seemed preoccupied during dinner. Kept checking his watch, made several phone calls. I assumed he was handling last-minute auction details, but his demeanor was definitely tense. Did you overhear any of these phone conversations? Fragments only. Something about maintaining agreements and protecting interests. Business terminology, but his tone was urgent. Marcus filed this information and called for Sandra Vance, the gallery director. Entered with controlled hostility, her professional mask barely concealing years of accumulated resentment. Miss Vance, you were formerly Mr. Ashford's business partner for 7 years until he bought out my share 3 years ago. Her voice carried acid precision. Victor had family money and better connections. When expansion required additional capital investment, he chose to eliminate the partner rather than share future profits. A hostile buyout? Legal, but barely ethical. He waited until I faced personal financial pressures, then presented an ultimatum: sell my share at below market value or watch the gallery fold. Entirely. Sandra's hands clenched into fists. I built that business from nothing. My expertise, my client relationships, my reputation. Victor inherited his father's collection and bought legitimacy. Yet, you maintained professional contact. The art world is surprisingly small, detective. Avoiding Victor entirely would have been career suicide. I attended events, participated in acquisitions, maintained civil relations. Professional necessity, not personal choice. Marcus sensed deeper currents of anger. Tonight's auction, were you bidding on any lots? The Renaissance drawings interested me. Not the Monet Mu controversial, too expensive. My gallery focuses on emerging artists and mid-range classical pieces. Different market segment entirely, but you knew about the authentication disputes? Of course. Helena Morrison has been quite vocal about her concerns. Frankly, I hope she was right. Victor deserved to face consequences for once in his privileged life. Strong words for someone maintaining civil relations. Sandra's facade cracked completely. You want honesty, detective? I despise Victor Ashford. He represented everything wrong with the art world inherited privilege, purchased credibility, ruthless business practices. But despising someone doesn't make you a murderer. Where were you between 9 and 9-20-5? Main auction room with everyone else. I was reviewing auction results, calculating final sale totals. Thomas Wright was nearby working on insurance assessments. He can verify my presence. Marcus noticed the pattern, multiple suspects citing Thomas Wright as their alibi witness. The insurance investigator was becoming a crucial figure in establishing timeline accuracy. Did you notice Mr. Ashford's departure? He announced he was handling final preparations, then left through the corridor toward his office. I assumed he was preparing payment authorizations or certificates of authenticity. Standard post-auction procedures. Thomas Wright entered next, carrying his briefcase with professional efficiency. His demeanor suggested someone accustomed to detailed investigations and systematic analysis. Mr. Wright, your role tonight? Insurance assessment for Rothschild's potential acquisitions. He requires comprehensive coverage before bidding on high-value pieces. I was documenting condition reports, verifying provenance, calculating replacement values. You interacted with several other guests during the critical time frame, correct? James Rothschild discussed authentication documents around 9:10. Sandra Vance consulted with me about market valuations around 9:15. Rebecca Sterling asked about coverage requirements for emerging collectors around 9:20. Marcus appreciated Wright's precise timeline. You seem to have been the evening's unofficial timekeeper, occupational habit. Insurance investigations require meticulous documentation. I automatically note times, locations, interactions. It's become second nature after 15 years in the business. Your assessment of tonight's disputed Monet? Wright opened his briefcase and retrieved a thick folder. Inconclusive. The painting exhibits characteristics consistent with both authentic Monet technique and sophisticated forgery methods. 3 expert opinions contradict Dr. Morrison's authentication challenges. Without additional technical analysis, I couldn't recommend coverage at full appraised value. Meaning, if Rothschild had successfully bid tonight, I would have suggested coverage at 60% of purchase price pending additional verification. The authentication controversy creates significant liability exposure. Eleanor looked up from her notes. That would represent substantial financial loss if the piece proved fake, approximately $1.6 million based on expected final bid prices. Enough to ruin most collectors' long-term acquisition strategies. Marcus studied Wright's composed demeanor. The insurance investigator possessed both analytical skills and financial knowledge that could facilitate complex fraud schemes. Yet his methodical approach to documentation made him an unlikely candidate for impulsive murder. Did Mr. Ashford seem concerned about insurance implications? He seemed concerned about everything tonight. Made several references to protecting his reputation and maintaining professional standards. I interpreted this as auction-related stress, but in retrospect, his anxiety seemed disproportionate. Rebecca Sterling entered reluctantly, her youthful face pale with exhaustion and fear. At 26, she seemed overwhelmed by the evening's events and the scrutiny of formal interrogation. Miss Sterling, you discovered Mr. Ashford's body? I went looking for him when he didn't return. The auction was supposed to conclude with final bidding instructions, but he'd been gone for almost 10 minutes. Her voice trembled slightly. I thought maybe he was taking a private phone call or handling some last-minute detail. You didn't knock before trying the door? I did knock. No answer. That's when I tried the handle and found it locked. I called for help immediately. Dr. Morrison suggested breaking it down. Marcus noted the slight inconsistency with Dr. Morrison's account. You called for help before discovering the body? Rebecca flushed red. I was scared. Something felt wrong. Victor was obsessive about timing and schedules. Disappearing during auction conclusion was completely out of character. How well did you know Mr. Ashford? Professionally only. I'm relatively new to high-end dealing. Tonight was my first invitation to one of his exclusive auctions. I was hoping to establish business relationships, maybe participate in future events. Tears welled in her eyes. This was supposed to be my breakthrough opportunity. Financial troubles in your current business? Rebecca's composure collapsed entirely. Yes, my gallery is struggling. Rent, insurance, inventory costs, everything is so expensive when you're starting out. I was counting on tonight's networking to generate new clients, desperate enough to consider illegal solutions. Asterisk, no. I mean, yes, I was desperate, but not for murder. I needed connections, referrals, maybe partnership opportunities. Killing. Victor would destroy any chance of success in this field. Marcus sensed genuine distress rather than calculated deception. Where were you between 9 and 9:25? Main auction room, talking with Thomas Wright about insurance requirements for new collectors. I was taking notes, asking questions about coverage procedures. Thomas was very helpful. He explained how verification processes protect against authentication disputes. Finally, Marcus summoned Professor Edmund Blackthorne. The elderly collector entered with dignified bearing, his silver hair perfectly groomed despite the late hour. At 78, he possessed the calm authority of someone who had witnessed decades of human behavior. Professor, you were Mr. Ashford's mentor? For 30 years, yes. I knew Victor's father, helped guide Victor's development as both collector and businessman. Tonight's tragic end represents the loss of my most promising protege. His voice carried genuine sorrow, yet you seemed remarkably calm when I announced his murder. Professor Blackthorne smiled sadly. Detective, at my age, shock becomes increasingly difficult to sustain. I've seen enough human tragedy to recognize that evil often wears familiar faces. If Victor was murdered, then someone he trusted betrayed that faith most completely. Who would Victor have trusted with access to his private office? Anyone in tonight's gathering? We were his professional circle colleagues, clients, business associates. Victor was actually quite trusting, perhaps naively so. He believed in the honor system that supposedly governs art dealing. Marcus found the professor's philosophical approach intriguing. You dozed during our initial gathering. Weren't you concerned about the investigation? Worried minds rarely rest, Detective. My ability to sleep suggested either complete innocence or masterful guilt. I leave that determination to your expertise. Where were you during the critical time frame? Conversing with Dr. Morrison about authentication methodologies. We discussed the evolution of technical analysis, the challenges of proving provenance for historical pieces. Academic discussions that probably bored the other guests. Did this conversation include the disputed Monet? Peripherally, Helena Dr. Morrison is passionate about her research, but I counsel patience. Authentication disputes can take years to resolve definitively. Rushing to judgment often proves embarrassing for all parties involved. Eleanor asked, Professor, did you notice anything unusual about Mr. Ashford's behavior tonight? The elderly man considered carefully. Victor seemed bottomed. He carried himself like someone facing difficult decisions. I assumed he was wrestling with the Monet controversy, but perhaps other pressures were involved. What sort of pressures? Financial, professional, personal. Victor never discussed private matters, but one develops intuition about such things over time. Tonight, he seemed like a man approaching a crossroads. Asterisk as the individual interrogations concluded. Marcus reviewed Eleanor's comprehensive notes. Each suspect had provided alibis, but the corroborating witnesses were primarily each other, a closed circle that made verification difficult. More troubling, everyone possessed both motive and opportunity. While their collective presence in the main auction room created mutual alibi protection, Preliminary assessment? Eleanor asked as they prepared for the next phase of investigation. Too convenient, Marcus replied grimly. 6 suspects, all with alibis provided by the other 5. Either we're dealing with remarkable coincidence, or our killer has manipulated the entire situation to create reasonable doubt. At 3:30 a.m., Marcus assembled the suspects in the library for his preliminary findings. Fatigue had worn down their defenses, making this an optimal time for psychological pressure. Ladies and gentlemen, my initial investigation has revealed several disturbing facts. First, Mr. Ashford was murdered with cyanide administered through his brandy. Second, the locked room was staged to suggest suicide. Third, someone opened his private safe after death and removed unknown contents. The announcement created visible tension. Dr. Morrison adjusted her glasses nervously. Rothschild's jaw tightened. Sandra Vance crossed her arms defensively. Wright made notes in his ever-present notepad. Rebecca Sterling began crying quietly. Only Professor Blackthorne remained outwardly calm. Furthermore, Marcus continued, everyone in this room had both motive and opportunity. Dr. Morrison faced career destruction over the authentication dispute. Mr. Rothschild risked massive financial loss from a forged purchase. Miss Vance harbored years of resentment over business betrayal. Mr. Wright could have been protecting his professional reputation. Miss Sterling was desperate for business success. Professor Blackthorne, he paused dramatically, possessed the deep personal knowledge necessary to manipulate Victor's trusty nature. This is preposterous, Rothschild interjected. You're accusing all of us simultaneously. I'm observing that you've all constructed remarkably similar alibis. Mr. Rothschild, curious how everyone was in the main auction room. Everyone was having public conversations. Everyone can be vouched for by multiple witnesses. Almost as if this scenario was planned in advance, Rebecca Sterling's tears intensified. You think we conspired together? That's impossible. Most of us barely knew each other before tonight. Perhaps. Or perhaps someone orchestrated tonight's events very carefully, ensuring that multiple suspects would be present with credible motives and mutual alibi. Protection. Marcus let this possibility sink in before continuing. However, our killer made several crucial mistakes. First, the brandy glass was repositioned after death, a detail that betrayed the suicide staging. Second, the blackmail note was placed too obviously, suggesting misdirection rather than genuine extortion. Third, the safe was opened using knowledge only available to someone with intimate access to Victor's private information. He studied each face carefully. But most importantly, our killer revealed specific knowledge they shouldn't have possessed. During my earlier announcement, one of you made a verbal slip that demonstrated guilty knowledge of evidence not yet revealed. Room fell silent except for the fire's crackling. Marcus felt the psychological pressure building, threatening to crack the careful facades each suspect had maintained. Tomorrow morning, Inspector Carter will arrest Victor Ashford's murderer. Tonight's events were carefully orchestrated, but not carefully enough. The truth will emerge, and justice will be served, as the suspects filed out under police escort to temporary quarters. Marcus reviewed the evening's revelations with Eleanor and Inspector Carter. Multiple motives, overlapping alibis, physical evidence that seemed almost deliberately planted. The case bore all the hallmarks of sophisticated manipulation. Your assessment? Carter asked. We're dealing with an exceptional mind, Marcus replied. Someone who understood group psychology well enough to create a situation where multiple suspects would provide mutual protection. But they underestimated my ability to detect the psychological patterns underlying their deception. Eleanor looked up from her notes. The verbal slip you mentioned, which suspect revealed guilty knowledge? Marcus smiled grimly. That detail will become clear when we unravel the full extent of tonight's deception. For now, get some rest. Tomorrow, we expose a killer who thought they had created the perfect crime. As dawn approached over the Catskill Mountains, Detective Marcus Blackwood prepared for the final act of a deadly drama that had been months in the planning. Someone in the Ashford Gallery had committed murder with meticulous precision, but they had failed to account for one crucial variable: the relentless, methodical patience of a man whose life's work was exposing the darkness that lurked behind carefully constructed lies. Dawn painted the Catskill Mountains in shades of amber and gold as Detective Marcus Blackwood stood before the massive windows of the Ashford Gallery's main auction room. The storm had passed, leaving the landscape pristine and deceptively peaceful. Behind him, Eleanor Hayes arranged evidence photographs on a mahogany table, while Inspector Carter reviewed witness statements. From the night's interrogations, "The verbal slip," Eleanor said, breaking the contemplative silence. "You mentioned one of the suspects revealed guilty knowledge. Which one?" Marcus turned from the window, his steel-gray eyes reflecting the morning light. "Rebecca Sterling. When I announced the discovery of a blackmail note, she immediately asked about notes plural. I had specifically used the singular form. Her subconscious revealed knowledge of multiple planted pieces of evidence, suggesting she placed them herself, or observed someone else placing them. Either way, Miss Sterling knows more than she's admitted." Marcus moved to the evidence table, studying the crime scene photographs with methodical precision. But that's merely one thread in a much larger tapestry of deception. Inspector Carter looked up from his paperwork. "The coroner's preliminary report just arrived. Cyanide confirmed, administered approximately 15 minutes before the body was discovered. Also found traces of sedative in Ashford's system, something to make him compliant, before the poison was introduced. Interesting. Our killer needed Victor conscious but docile when the cyanide was administered. This suggests a face-to-face encounter, someone he trusted implicitly." Marcus examined the brandy glass evidence photos. "Eleanor, what did you observe about the suspect's behavior during interrogation?" Eleanor consulted her detailed notes. Dr. Morrison displayed classic academic defensive patterns, precise language, controlled responses, but genuine emotional stress when discussing her career threats. Rothschild showed financial anxiety rather than guilt patterns. Sandra Vance exhibited long-term resentment but seemed genuinely surprised by the murder accusation. And the others? Thomas Wright maintained professional composure throughout, almost too controlled, as if he was accustomed to being investigated. Rebecca Sterling showed extreme stress responses consistent with either guilt or terror. Professor Blackthorne ... Eleanor paused, reconsidering. Actually, Professor Blackthorne was the most interesting. His calm demeanor could indicate either complete innocence or masterful psychological control. Marcus nodded approvingly. Eleanor's observational skills had sharpened considerably during their partnership. Your assessment aligns with my own observations, but we're still missing crucial pieces of the puzzle. Inspector, I need to examine Ashford's personal quarters and business records. Also, contact his bank and legal representatives. We need complete financial disclosure. Already in progress. Ashford's attorney is driving up from Manhattan this morning. Bank records should be available within the hour. Excellent. Meanwhile, I want to reconstruct last night's timeline with scientific precision. Every movement, every conversation, every moment when someone could have slipped away unnoticed. Investigation teams spent the morning methodically mapping the gallery's layout and identifying potential blind spots in the suspect's mutual alibi system. The building's architecture, with its numerous alcoves and branching corridors, provided several opportunities for brief, undetected absences from the main auction room. Eleanor discovered the first significant breakthrough while examining the gallery's guest registration system. Marcus, look at this. Rebecca Sterling's invitation was issued only 3 days ago, a last-minute addition to tonight's guest list. Who requested her addition? According to the records, Victor Ashford himself. But here's what's curious. Miss Sterling claimed this was her first invitation to one of his exclusive auctions. Why would Ashford suddenly invite an unknown, struggling dealer to such a high-stakes event? Marcus studied the invitation records. Unless she wasn't unknown to him, or unless someone else requested her presence and Ashford complied for reasons we haven't yet discovered. 10:30 a.m. Ashford's attorney arrived, a distinguished gentleman named Harrison Webb, who had represented the gallery owner for over 2 decades. His revelations about Ashford's recent activities proved illuminating. Victor contacted me last week about updating his will, Webb explained as they sat in the gallery's conference room. He seemed concerned about protecting his assets from potential litigation. When I pressed for details, he mentioned authentication disputes and professional challenges that might require a legal defense. Did he specify the nature of these challenges? Marcus asked. Nothing concrete, but he did ask about the legal implications of knowingly selling forged artwork. I advised him that such actions could result in both civil litigation and criminal prosecution. He seemed troubled by this information. Eleanor leaned forward. Troubled how? Victor was typically confident, even arrogant, about his expertise and business practices. But last week, he appeared genuinely worried. He kept asking hypothetical questions about criminal liability, asset protection, plea bargaining procedures. Most unusual for someone of his temperament, Marcus felt pieces of the puzzle shifting into new configurations. Did Mr. Ashford mention any specific individuals who might pose threats to his business or reputation? He referenced academic interference and professional jealousy, but no specific names. However, he did ask me to research the legal backgrounds of several art world figures, dealers, collectors, historians. I assume he was evaluating potential adversaries. Do you have that research? Webb produced a manila folder from his briefcase. 6 individuals, all members of tonight's gathering. Victor wanted to know about any legal vulnerabilities, financial pressures, or personal scandals that might create leverage opportunities. Marcus examined the dossiers with growing interest. Each file contained detailed background information that went far beyond public knowledge. Victor Ashford had been conducting comprehensive intelligence gathering on his own. Guests, the behavior of someone expecting confrontation or blackmail. Scenarios. Dr. Morrison's file revealed a previous plagiarism accusation that had nearly destroyed her early career. James Rothschild had faced a SEC investigation for suspicious trading patterns related to art acquisitions. Sandra Vance had defaulted on several business loans following her bailout from the gallery partnership. Thomas Wright had been disciplined by his professional association for conflicts of interest in previous cases. Rebecca Sterling's gallery was facing bankruptcy proceedings that hadn't yet become public knowledge. Even Professor Blackthorne had secrets, a gambling addiction that had cost him significant portions of his collection over the years. Victor was building a comprehensive threat assessment. Marcus concluded. He knew that each of these individuals had vulnerabilities that could be exploited if necessary. But the question remains, was he planning to use this information, or was he defending against someone who already possessed it? Eleanor studied the files intently. These are all recent investigations compiled within the last month. Something triggered Victor's paranoia about his inner circle, or someone in his inner circle triggered his defensive preparations. Marcus closed the files thoughtfully. Inspector, I want complete financial records for all 6 suspects covering the past year. Also, check for any recent communications between Ashford and each of them, emails, phone calls, letters, anything that might reveal the catalyst for his investigation. by noon. The financial records painted a disturbing picture of interconnected vulnerabilities and desperate circumstances. Rebecca Sterling's gallery was indeed facing imminent closure. She owed over $200,000, in debts with no viable source of repayment. Sandra Vance had been secretly negotiating with several of Ashford's major clients, attempting to establish competing business relationships. Professor Blackthorne had been quietly selling pieces from his collection to cover gambling losses, including several works that may have been acquired through questionable means, but the most shocking revelation came from Thomas Wright's professional records. The insurance investigator had been conducting unauthorized evaluations of Ashford gallery pieces for over 6 months, building detailed assessments that could be used to challenge authenticity claims or manipulate market valuations. Industrial espionage, Carter observed. Wright was systematically documenting Ashford's inventory for unknown purposes, or known purposes, that we haven't yet identified. Marcus reviewed Wright's meticulous documentation. These reports are far too detailed for routine insurance assessment. Someone commissioned this intelligence gathering, and I suspect that someone is among our remaining suspects. Eleanor discovered another crucial clue while examining the gallery's security system. Marcus, the camera footage from last night shows something interesting. At 8:47 p.m., 13 minutes before Ashford's announced departure, someone briefly disabled the motion sensors in the corridor leading to his office. Duration of the disabling? Approximately 3 minutes. Long enough for someone to plant evidence or prepare the scene for later use. Marcus studied the security timeline. Who had access to the control panel? According to the system manual, only Ashford himself and anyone with override codes. But the disabling was accomplished through physical manipulation rather than electronic access. Someone with technical expertise bypassed the system directly. Thomas Wright, Marcus concluded. His insurance background would include security system knowledge. He could have disabled the sensors during the pre-auction cocktail period when guests were moving freely throughout the gallery. The investigation team spent the afternoon reconstructing the precise sequence of events leading to Ashford's murder. The timeline revealed a sophisticated plan that required intimate knowledge of both the victim's habits and the gallery's security systems. At 4 p.m., Marcus assembled the suspects for what he announced would be his final investigative session. The 6 individuals, now haggard from stress and sleepless hours, gathered reluctantly in the library where their ordeal had begun nearly 18 hours earlier. Ladies and gentlemen, Marcus began, his voice carrying the authority of impending resolution. My investigation has uncovered a conspiracy of remarkable sophistication. Mr. Ashford's murder was not the impulsive act of a single individual, but rather the culmination of months of careful planning by someone who understood both his vulnerabilities and the psychology of this particular group. Rebecca. Sterling began crying again, her emotional control finally collapsing completely. Dr. Morrison removed her glasses and cleaned them with trembling hands. Rothschild lit another cigarette with sharp, nervous movements. Sandra Vance maintained her defensive posture, but her face had grown pale. Thomas Wright continued taking notes, his professional facade intact. Professor Blackthorne watched with sad, knowing eyes. The killer faced a complex challenge, Marcus continued. How to murder Victor Ashford while ensuring that suspicion would be distributed among multiple viable suspects. The solution required creating a scenario where everyone present had both motive and opportunity, while maintaining plausible alibis through mutual witness protection. He began pacing before the assembled group, his movements measured and deliberate. First, the guest list was carefully curated to include individuals with existing grievances against the victim, Dr. Morrison's authentication dispute, Mr. Rothschild's financial exposure, Miss Vance's business resentment, Miss Sterling's desperate circumstances, Professor Blackthorne's personal vulnerabilities. Each of you represented a potential suspect with obvious motive. That's ridiculous, Rothschild interjected. You're suggesting someone orchestrated this entire evening to frame us collectively? Not to frame you, Mr. Rothschild, but to hide among you. Our killer needed cover multiple suspects with credible motives to obscure their own guilt. Marcus paused before continuing. Second, the timing was crucial. The murder had to occur during a period when all suspects were ostensibly together, creating mutual alibi protection that would make individual guilt difficult to prove. Eleanor consulted her notes. The security system manipulation supports this theory. Someone with technical knowledge disabled motion sensors 13 minutes before. Mr. Ashford left the auction room. Precisely. Our killer prepared the scene in advance, ensuring that evidence would be positioned to support the suicide theory while also planting materials to suggest alternative motives. Marcus studied each face carefully, but they made one critical error. They revealed knowledge that only the murderer could possess. The room fell silent except for Rebecca Sterling's quiet sobbing. Marcus felt a familiar thrill of approaching resolution. The moment when careful analysis would finally expose the truth hidden beneath layers of deception. Furthermore, he continued, Mr. Ashford had been conducting his own investigation into this group's vulnerabilities. He suspected that someone among his trusted associates posed a threat to his business and reputation. His recent legal consultations and financial preparations suggest he was anticipating either blackmail or litigation. Thomas Wright looked up from his notepad. Are you suggesting that Victor discovered our killer's identity before his death? I'm suggesting that Victor Ashford was a man preparing for war. Mr. Wright, he had compiled detailed intelligence on each of you, documenting financial pressures, legal vulnerabilities, and personal scandals. Someone in this room represented such a significant threat that he felt compelled to build a comprehensive defense strategy. Professor Blackthorne spoke for the first time. Victor was always thorough in his business dealings, Detective. If he suspected betrayal within his inner circle, he would indeed prepare accordingly. The question is whether his preparations proved sufficient to protect him. They did not, Professor, because our killer possessed one advantage that Victor failed to anticipate. Marcus moved to the evidence table and retrieved the blackmail note discovered in Ashford's office. This message, "You know my secret," was placed to misdirect investigation toward external blackmail. But the real secret was much closer to home. He held up the forensic analysis report. The paper stock and ink composition match materials found in this very gallery. Our killer used Ashford's own supplies to create false evidence, suggesting intimate familiarity with his office and work habits. Eleanor added, the cyanide was administered through brandy that Mr. Ashford kept in his private office, a tale known only to his closest associates. The killer required access not just to the poison, but to his personal habits and preferences. Most importantly, Marcus concluded, the murder required someone who could manipulate both the victim and the witness group with surgical precision. Someone who understood group psychology well enough to create a situation where 6 potential suspects would unknowingly provide mutual protection for the real killer. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the gallery's marble floors, Detective Marcus Blackwood prepared to unveil the truth behind one of the most sophisticated murder schemes he had ever encountered. The killer sat among them still, hidden behind carefully constructed facades and elaborate alibis. But their psychological armor was finally beginning to crack under relentless methodical pressure. Tomorrow's dawn would bring justice for Victor Ashford, but tonight would reveal the dark genius who had turned a gathering of colleagues into an unwitting conspiracy of mutual protection. The final act of this deadly drama was about to begin. Asterisk. The grandfather clock in the Ashford Gallery's library chimed 6 times as Detective Marcus Blackwood positioned himself before the assembled suspects for his final revelation. Evening shadows stretched across the Persian rugs while flames danced in the stone hearth, casting dramatic light across 6 faces that had maintained their secrets for over 20 hours. Eleanor Hayes sat at the mahogany table with her comprehensive notes spread before her like a map of human deception. Inspector Carter stood near the door, his hand resting on his service weapon, a reminder that justice waited just beyond this civilized gathering. The 6 suspects occupied their familiar positions, Dr. Morrison with her academic composure, Rothschild smoking nervously, Sandra Vance wrapped in defensive hostility, Thomas Wright maintaining professional detachment, Rebecca Sterling trembling with exhaustion, and Professor Blackthorne observing with sad wisdom. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus began, his voice cutting through the tension like a surgeon's blade. 23 hours ago, Victor Ashford was murdered in this gallery by someone he trusted implicitly. Tonight, I will demonstrate exactly how this crime was committed, who planned it, and why they believed they could escape detection. He moved to the evidence table, lifting the blackmail note with careful precision. This investigation began with what appeared to be a locked room suicide complicated by contradictory evidence. The locked door, the positioned brandy glass, the carefully placed blackmail note all suggested a man overwhelmed by scandal choosing poison over exposure. But every element of this scene was deliberately constructed to deceive. Rebecca Sterling's sobbing intensified, drawing concerned glances from several other suspects. Marcus noted the psychological pressure building throughout the room, exactly the conditions needed to crack even sophisticated deception. The first clue came from the victim's behavior patterns. Victor Ashford was a methodical man who rarely acted impulsively. Yet we were expected to believe he suddenly decided to commit suicide in the middle of hosting his most important auction of the year. The contradiction demanded deeper investigation. Eleanor consulted her notes. The forensic evidence supported murder from the beginning. The brandy glass placement, the absence of hesitation marks, the presence of sedatives alongside the cyanide all indicated external administration rather than voluntary consumption, precisely. But our killer was sophisticated enough to anticipate forensic analysis. They planted evidence designed to create multiple alternative theories: blackmail, business disputes, authentication controversies, anything to muddy the investigative waters. Marcus retrieved the dossiers compiled by Ashford's attorney. What they didn't anticipate was Victor's own investigation into this group's vulnerabilities. Dr. Morrison finally spoke, her voice strained with exhaustion. "You're suggesting Victor knew he was in danger?" "I'm stating that Victor Ashford spent the last month of his life preparing for war." Dr. Morrison, he compiled detailed intelligence on each of you, documenting financial pressures, legal vulnerabilities, personal scandals. He consulted with attorneys about asset protection and criminal liability. He updated his will and security procedures. These are not the actions of a man contemplating suicide. They're the preparations of someone expecting attack. Thomas Wright looked up from his eternal note-taking. "But if Victor suspected one of us specifically, why invite us all to tonight's auction?" "An excellent question, Mr. Wright. The answer reveals the psychological sophistication of our killer." Marcus began his methodical reconstruction, pacing before the assembled group like a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. Victor didn't suspect one individual, he suspected a conspiracy. His research revealed that several of you had been secretly communicating, sharing information about his business practices, coordinating what appeared to be a coordinated assault on his reputation and financial stability. Rothschild stubbed out his cigarette with violent movements. "That's preposterous. We barely knew each other before tonight." "Another misconception, Mr. Rothschild. My investigation revealed extensive prior communications between several members of this group. Sandra Vance had been secretly negotiating with your art acquisition contacts. Thomas Wright had been providing unauthorized insurance assessments to multiple parties. Dr. Morrison had been sharing her authentication research with individuals who could use that information for financial advantage. Sandra Vance's defensive posture cracked slightly. Business networking isn't conspiracy, detective. The art world operates through professional relationships and information sharing. True, Ms. Vance, but when that information sharing is designed to manipulate market conditions, destroy reputations, and facilitate fraud, it becomes criminal conspiracy. Marcus retrieved a manila folder from Eleanor's collection. Victor's private correspondence reveals he had discovered systematic efforts to undermine his gallery's credibility and financial stability. He opened the folder, revealing photocopied emails and documents. These communications, recovered from Victor's private files, show coordination between several parties to challenge the authenticity of major pieces in his collection, manipulate insurance valuations, and destroy his professional relationships with key collectors. Rebecca Sterling's crying had escalated to near hysteria, drawing increasingly suspicious glances from the other suspects. Professor Blackthorne watched her with particular interest, his elderly eyes narrowing with recognition. But here's where our killer made their first crucial error. Marcus continued, moving toward Rebecca with predatory focus. When I announced the discovery of blackmail evidence, Miss Sterling immediately asked about notes plural, though I had specifically mentioned finding a note singular. Her subconscious revealed knowledge of multiple planted pieces of evidence. Rebecca's face went completely white. I was confused. You were revealing guilty knowledge, Miss Sterling. Knowledge that only the person who planted those notes could possess. Marcus studied her trembling form with clinical detachment. But that was merely the beginning of your mistakes. Eleanor stood, consulting her detailed timeline. Miss Sterling, you claim this was your first invitation to Mr. Ashford's exclusive auctions, yet you displayed remarkable familiarity with the gallery's layout, security procedures, and Ashford's personal habits. You knew exactly where to find his private office, how to access the corridor, where he kept his personal brandy supply. I had a tour. Earlier, Victor showed me around. Victor Ashford conducted no tours yesterday afternoon, Miss Sterling. Security records show you arrived at precisely 6 p.m. with the other guests. Yet you navigated this complex building with the confidence of someone who had studied its layout extensively. Marcus moved closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting. You had been here before, hadn't you? The question hung in the air like a physical presence. Rebecca Sterling's composure finally collapsed completely, her carefully maintained facade crumbling under relentless psychological pressure. But Miss Sterling presented us with a fascinating puzzle, Marcus continued, his tone becoming almost conversational. How could a struggling young dealer with financial troubles mastermind such a sophisticated scheme? How could someone with no apparent connections to the other suspects coordinate their involvement? How could a person with limited art world experience manipulate seasoned professionals like pawns in an elaborate game? He paused dramatically, studying each suspect's face with scientific precision. The answer is simple. She couldn't. Rebecca Sterling is not our killer, she's our killer's accomplice. The revelation hit like a physical blow. Every head turned toward Rebecca, who had begun hyperventilating with terror. But Marcus wasn't finished with his psychological dissection. Miss Sterling, you've been blackmailed into participation, haven't you? Someone discovered your gallery's illegal activities, forgery sales, fraudulent provenance documents, money laundering for organized crime figures. Someone who could destroy your life with a single phone call unless you provided assistance with tonight's elaborate deception. Rebecca nodded frantically, unable to speak through her panic. Marcus felt the familiar satisfaction of psychological breakthrough. The moment when carefully constructed lies finally surrender to methodical pressure. Tell us about your handler, Miss Sterling. Who recruited you? Who provided the detailed knowledge of this gallery's systems? Who supplied the cyanide and orchestrated this evening's events? Through choking sobs, Rebecca finally began to speak. They said they would expose everything, the forged certificates, the money transfers, all of it. My gallery would be destroyed. I'd face criminal charges. They just wanted me to plant some evidence, disable the security system for a few minutes, provide alibis when needed. Who, Miss Sterling? Give me a name. Rebecca looked around the room with terrified eyes, searching for escape that didn't exist. Finally, her gaze settled on one individual with recognition and desperate appeal. Thomas, she whispered. Thomas Wright. He said it would just be insurance fraud, nothing more. He never mentioned murder. The accusation hung in the air for perhaps 3 seconds before Thomas Wright began to laugh, a sound devoid of humor that chilled everyone present. His professional facade finally cracked, revealing the calculating intelligence that had orchestrated 24 hours of masterful deception. Remarkable. Detective Blackwood. Though I suspect you've known the truth for several hours and simply needed Miss Sterling's confession to provide legal evidence, Wright closed his notepad with deliberate precision, his movements suddenly calm and controlled. Yes, I killed Victor Ashford. And yes, I manipulated this entire evening to ensure that suspicion would be distributed among multiple viable suspects. Inspector. Carter's hand moved to his service weapon, but Wright made no aggressive movements. Instead, he sat back in his chair with the relaxed posture of someone finally relieved of a tremendous psychological burden. The question, Detective, is whether you can prove how I accomplished it while maintaining a perfect alibi. Witnessed by 5 separate individuals, Marcus smiled grimly. That demonstration was always going to be the centerpiece of tonight's revelation. Mr. Wright, Eleanor, would you please retrieve the evidence we discovered this afternoon? Eleanor returned from the corridor carrying a small metal container and several evidence bags. During our final search of the gallery's maintenance areas, we found Mr. Wright's insurance investigation equipment, including a remote control delivery system disguised as a routine sprinkler valve. Wright's composure flickered slightly, but he maintained his calm demeanor. Ingenious theory, Detective. Please continue. You didn't need to leave the auction room to poison Victor Ashford. Mr. Wright, you had spent months studying this building's systems, mapping every corridor, documenting every security vulnerability. You knew that Victor kept brandy in his office, knew his habits, knew he would retreat there for private discussions during auction conclusions. Marcus moved to the evidence table, arranging the recovered materials like pieces of an elaborate puzzle. 6 months ago, you installed a remote-controlled mechanism in the building's plumbing system, a device that could introduce substances into the water supply of specific rooms. Tonight, you simply activated that mechanism, using a radio transmitter, disguised as your professional notepad, the notepad that Wright had been using throughout the investigation was revealed to contain sophisticated electronic components. Eleanor demonstrated how the device could send coded signals to receivers hidden throughout the building. The cyanide was introduced into Victor's office water system at precisely 9:10 p.m. at 5 minutes before he left the auction room. When he poured his usual brandy and added his customary splash of water, he unknowingly consumed a lethal dose of poison. You remained in the auction room throughout, witnessed by 5 separate individuals, while your mechanical accomplice committed murder in a locked room. Double quotes. Dr. Morrison stared at Wright with academic fascination and horror. The technical sophistication required for such a system, you've been planning this for months? Years. Actually, Wright replied with professional pride. Victor Ashford represented everything corrupt about the art authentication system. He knowingly sold forgeries, manipulated market values, destroyed careers to protect his profits. Someone had to stop him, so you recruited accomplices. Marcus continued, people with legitimate grievances who could provide cover for your real motives. You leaked information to Dr. Morrison about authentication irregularities, knowing her academic integrity would compel her to challenge Victor publicly. You provided financial intelligence to Mr. Rothschild that would make him paranoid about investment security. You shared business information with Miss Vance that would reignite her resentment over their partnership. Dissolution. Sandra Vance looked stunned. The market analysis you provided last month that was deliberately designed to make me suspicious of Victor's business practices. Precisely, Miss Vance. I needed each of you to have credible, documented motives for wanting Victor dead. You unknowingly provided perfect cover for the real killer's psychological profile. Wright's voice carried the satisfaction of a chess master explaining a successful gambit. Professor Blackthorne's gambling debts, Miss Sterling's financial crimes, every vulnerability was cataloged and exploited to create the perfect ensemble of suspects. Professor Blackthorne spoke with sad recognition. You used our weaknesses against us. Mr. Wright, very sophisticated manipulation, and very nearly successful, Marcus acknowledged. Your plan required extraordinary attention to detail and deep understanding of human psychology. You created a scenario where 6 potential suspects would provide mutual alibi protection while hiding your own guilt among their collective motives. Eleanor consulted her evidence summary. But Mr. Wright made several crucial errors that ultimately exposed his involvement. The security system manipulation required technical expertise that none of the other suspects possessed. The remote-controlled poisoning system represented months of preparation that contradicted any theory of impulsive murder. Most importantly, his comprehensive documentation of everyone's movements created suspiciously detailed alibis for all parties. Insurance investigators are trained to notice patterns and document everything, Wright said defensively. My detailed record-keeping was professional habit, not guilty consciousness. Perhaps. But insurance investigators aren't typically commissioned to conduct unauthorized evaluations of specific collections for unknown clients. Marcus retrieved Wright's hidden files from the evidence collection. Your 6-month study of Ashford Gallery pieces wasn't random professional development, it was systematic intelligence. Gathering for tonight's operation, Wright's calm facade finally began to crack under relentless exposure. Victor Ashford was a criminal who hid behind art world respectability. He destroyed careers, manipulated markets, sold forgeries to unsuspecting collectors. Someone had to expose him. So you appointed yourself judge, jury, and executioner? Inspector Carter spoke for the first time since the revelation began. You manipulated innocent people into becoming unwitting accomplices to murder. Innocent? Wright laughed bitterly. Dr. Morrison's plagiarism, Rothschild's CK violations, Vance's loan fraud, Sterling's forgery sales, Blackthorne's gambling addiction, none of you were innocent. You were all vulnerable to the same corruption that defined Victor's entire career. Marcus studied Wright's psychological deterioration with clinical interest. The careful mask of professional respectability had dissolved, revealing the obsessive personality that had spent years planning elaborate revenge against perceived injustice. Your mistake. Mr. Wright was believing that your superior intelligence entitled you to manipulate others like chess pieces. You saw people's weaknesses and assumed you could control their responses with scientific precision. Marcus moved closer, his voice carrying the authority of moral judgment. But human psychology isn't as predictable as insurance actuarial tables. People are capable of choosing integrity over self-interest, truth over convenience, justice over personal gain. Eleanor gathered the evidence materials as Inspector Carter prepared to make the arrest. The physical proof of Wright's guilt was overwhelming the remote-controlled poisoning system The unauthorized building modifications, the comprehensive intelligence files, Rebecca Sterling's testimony about their conspiracy. Thomas Wright, Carter announced formally, "You're under arrest for the murder of Victor Ashford and conspiracy to commit fraud. You have the right to remain silent." As the handcuffs clicked into place, Wright looked around the room one final time. His expression combined defeat with lingering professional pride in the elaborate schemes. "Sophistication. Detective Blackwood," he said as Carter began leading him toward the door. "How long did you know?" Marcus considered the question thoughtfully. "I suspected you from the second interrogation session. Your alibi was too perfect, your documentation too comprehensive, your technical knowledge too extensive. But I needed Miss Sterling's confession to provide legal proof of conspiracy. Any others will face appropriate consequences for their individual crimes, but they were victims of your manipulation rather than willing accomplices to murder." Marcus watched as the man who had orchestrated 24 hours of masterful deception was led away to face justice. "Your greatest error wasn't technical, Mr. Wright, it was moral. You assumed that everyone shared your willingness to sacrifice human life for abstract principles. As dawn broke over the Catskill Mountains for the muffins, for the Miftis, second time since their arrival, Detective Marcus Blackwood stood once again before the gallery's massive windows. The surviving suspects had been released pending further investigation of their individual legal troubles, while Rebecca Sterling faced prosecution for conspiracy charges. Professor Blackthorne had quietly disappeared sometime during the final revelations, presumably to address his own compromised situation before official scrutiny. Intensified. Eleanor packed their investigation materials with methodical efficiency. 24 hours ago, we had 6 suspects with equal motive and opportunity. How did you narrow the field so quickly? By recognizing that the crime's sophistication exceeded what any individual suspect could accomplish alone, Marcus replied. Wright's plan required months of preparation, technical expertise, psychological manipulation, and intimate knowledge of every participant's vulnerabilities. Only someone with professional training in risk assessment and systematic analysis could have orchestrated such elaborate deception. Inspector Carter joined them for the final case summary. The district attorney is confident we have enough evidence for conviction. Wright's confession, Sterling's testimony, the physical evidence of his poisoning system, it's an airtight case. Justice for Victor Ashford, despite his own moral compromises. Marcus gathered his personal investigation kit, the leather satchel that had accompanied him through countless mysteries over the years. Though I suspect Wright was correct about one thing, Ashford's business practices were indeed corrupt. His murder may have prevented exposure of systematic fraud throughout the art authentication system. Eleanor looked thoughtful as they prepared to leave the gallery. Do you think Wright saw himself as a crusader for justice? I think Thomas Wright was a man who confused personal revenge with moral righteousness, Marcus replied. He used other people's genuine grievances to hide his own obsessive hatred. That's not justice, that's manipulation disguised as virtue. As they drove down the mountain road toward Manhattan, Marcus reflected on the case's deeper implications. The Ashford Gallery mystery had revealed not just the sophistication of modern murder methods, but the dangerous psychology of individuals who appointed themselves arbiters of justice. Wright's technical brilliance had been matched by his moral blindness, a combination that had nearly produced the perfect crime, but there was no such thing as a perfect crime, Marcus knew. Human nature always provided the flaws that methodical investigation could exploit. Arrogance, impatience, the need for recognition, these psychological weaknesses ultimately exposed even the most carefully planned deceptions. The case was closed. Justice had been served, and Detective Marcus Blackwood was already anticipating the next challenge that would test his abilities against the endless creativity of human wickedness. In a world where technology made crime more sophisticated, the fundamental principles remained unchanged. Truth would emerge, patience would triumph over cleverness, and methodical investigation would always expose the darkness that lurked behind. Carefully constructed lies, the Crimson Gallery mystery had ended, but the eternal battle between justice and deception continued, somewhere in the shadows of human ambition and moral compromise.